So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Orr to the stage.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for that great introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Is the volume okay in the back? Okay. It's a great honor and privilege to be here with you today. Thank you very much for inviting me to share this time with you all. Really quick note, for those of you who are interested in these slides, I've posted them on SlideShare, which is a LinkedIn website. And if you just put in the search, my last name, and Beyond the Skills Gap, you can pull up the slides. So what I'd like to do today is share with you some findings from research we've done in Wisconsin and now across the country about the skills gap and how it may have some implications for the work that y'all are doing with the Career Pathways Initiative. Before I launch into some of our findings and what it may mean for your work, a really quick bio sketch. My background is a little bit eclectic. I studied English literature for my bachelor's degree, then cultural anthropology, and my PhD is in educational psychology with the focus on the learning sciences. And the common thread through all that, as you'll see in my talk, is a focus on culture and the implications that it has for student learning and career success. So when I first talked to Edward about speaking here today, I was planning on just talking about our book, which had just come out. And this book is based on research we've done throughout the state of Wisconsin, and now in 4 cities around the country: Denver, Seattle, Raleigh, North Carolina, right up the road, and Houston. And now we're branching out into some cross-national studies where we started in Eastern China, asking these main questions. What skills do employers need? Are these skills being taught and trained? How are these skills evaluated during the hiring process, which is a question that's not frequently asked in the academic literature? And then what role do education industry partnerships play? So again, I was planning on just talking about the findings that we've written about in our book. But one of the things that I discovered as I learned more about your initiative is that you're already focusing on some of the recommendations that we make in our book. It's been really great to see how multivocal the CPI is. Often in discussions of skills gap, it's employer interests that are at the heart of the discussion, which is important. But there's other people who have a role to play and stakes in the game. Students, educators, and employers, as well as society itself. The focus on curriculum and instruction in the CPI is really good to see as well. Recognition of the value of general education in the liberal arts, which often it's not only absent in conversations about the skills gap, but as I'll talk about in a minute, it's one of the main targets of skills gap policies and rhetoric. And then perhaps most important from the perspective of our research is the systems focus. How the CPI is focused on guided pathways that provide a student wraparound services while they're in college. And the reason that I say that this is one of the really great things to see is probably the main finding from our book and our research. And I know you can't see this in the back, but basically this is what we call the skills infrastructure. These are the components in a college or university and also in the labor market that we found to be essential to support students as they acquire 21st century competencies. And now when we think about educational reform and design, one of the principles of education reform and design about successful initiatives is you need to understand the systems first. What are some of the key leverage points that support students or inhibit their ability to acquire these competencies? And in our book, we talk about the importance of hands-on experiential education, centers for teaching and learning so that faculty and instructors are taught how to do this, because many of them are not, multidisciplinary general education, and then career and academic advising supports. And then the pathways between education and industry are also crucial. So this is part of the findings from our research in Wisconsin. And again, there are things that are really already being embedded within the CPI, but it's worth digging a little bit more deeply into some of these components, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. I want to spend some time talking in more depth about what are these 21st century competencies. What do we really mean when we talk about experiential education in the college classroom? When it comes to work-based learning programs such as internships, do we really know what's the best design features of a program for students and employers? And then the screening and hiring process. Like I mentioned, this is something that I think has gotten not enough attention in the whole career pathway conversation, and so I'll be talking about that as well. So the goals of my talk today, advance an alternative way of thinking about student employability, focusing on cultural capital instead of the skills gap in a human capital framework. I want to share some research-based ideas from cognitive psychology, learning science, and sociology of work about strategies about how we can do this a little bit better. And then I'm hoping to spark some critical reflection on your part. So as I present some of the findings from the literature, I'm going to be posing questions to you to really think about how institutional initiatives are being organized in relation to some of these findings. So I'm going to start with the skills gap idea, and this is the reason that I started this whole research program, because my governor, Scott Walker, was talking about it repeatedly. The idea is that there's plenty of jobs out there, and policymakers such as Governor Walker are hearing from employers they just can't find enough skilled workers to fill these positions. And so this is an idea that is not just dominant at the state level, but in discussions about apprenticeship programs a couple weeks ago from the White House, if you read the executive order the president signed, the skills gap rhetoric is front and center in the first paragraph. So this is a very influential idea. And the primary culprit for the skills gap, according to this framework, it's easy to pinpoint, it's higher education. Is the education system not adequately preparing the workforce? And according to this influential policy institute in Milwaukee, the consensus is yes. But it's not just any type of higher ed. It's four-year universities in particular, and the arts and humanities. In this case, it was Renaissance art that singled out as not leading students directly to jobs. Often you hear about French literature or art history. My personal favorite is Tarantino film studies, which was singled out in a report, which I didn't know existed. But the primary idea here is these are majors that aren't leading to occupations, and that's the primary problem. So this narrative, it's a pipeline or a supply chain way of framing the issues, where on the demand side, we have plenty of jobs. There's millions of jobs out there. It's the supply side that's the problem. And the solution from the policy angle has primarily been to create pathways or career ladders that lead students directly to high demand occupations. Now, the underlying theory informing the skills gap narrative is that of human capital, where investments in credentials and years of schooling and so on will pay off for the individual with increased wages, and it'll pay off for the labor market and increased productivity. Now, the question that we started to ask ourselves as researchers, and I would pose to you, is the skills gap narrative and the human capital framework the best way to think about problems with student employability? Now, this isn't just an academic question, because something in social psychology that's been discovered is this idea of frames, how cognitive frames have a way of rendering events or occurrences meaningful for people and groups of people, but it also organizes experience and guides action. So frames like the skills gap, they're not innocent. They actually mobilize resources and people and policy to specific actions. And so, as you'll see, there's a few problems with this narrative, and I'm going to quickly go through these. But one of them is there's very limited empirical evidence about the skills gap arguments. In particular, labor economists who have looked at this issue conclude it's a myth. Paul Krugman calls it a zombie idea that needs to die, but it keeps on coming back. And what they've looked at are things like, one of the occupations that's frequently talked about are welders. And so you'd expect to see increasing wages for welders in an area that's experiencing a skills gap. And Dr. Mark Levine found exactly the opposite, that in Milwaukee, wages were stagnating and even going down for welders. Another problem is that employer challenges with hiring are real. But the problem is they're caused by a lot more things other than educational attainment. These are some data that I analyzed for a series of focus groups conducted by the largest business lobby in Wisconsin. And you can see unqualified applicants are at the top of the list for causing hiring challenges. But they also talk about poor work ethic, facility locations. In Wisconsin, facilities that are located out in rural areas have a really hard time attracting people, especially young people. Then uncompetitive wages is one of those things that has to be part of the conversation. Some of these companies were offering wages that are not going to attract people, and they recognize that. Another problem is lack of attention to the skills in a really precise manner that employers are actually demanding. And here's an observation from a manufacturing in central Wisconsin. What's funny is that when we talk to our development board or the local technical college, and they talk about the skills gap, they're talking about teaching people to weld. The gap we see is people can't hold a job and can't solve a problem. And this raises issues about, are we thinking about skills with enough granularity to really be addressing the real issue? And often if you read skills gap reports, they don't define skills, or they talk about them in terms of industry clusters like healthcare or manufacturing. One of the other problems is the lack of attention to context, especially the structure of the labor market. So if you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics data, the jobs that are projected to grow the most to 2024 are the top 5. Only one pays above a living wage. That's registered nurses, which are not on this list. And so the fact that our economy has a lot of low-skill, low-wage jobs out there, and it's a huge part of the labor market, needs to be part of the conversation. Another issue is robots and automation. And this is a picture of a young man who's operating multiple oil fields in the gas field of the central Texas area. He's doing the work that used to take 5 or 6 employees. In this quote from the VP of his company, we want to transform our workforce to the point where we need to hire fewer people. And this isn't because they don't like people, it's because they don't need them. And you see in energy and manufacturing, productivity going up and the number of people required to do the work going down. And this also needs to be part of these conversations. And then the last problem with the skills gap narrative I'll mention has to do with hiring. In our research in Wisconsin, 74% of employers screen for fit with the organizational culture. What does that mean in practice? As one HR manager told us, people who are absolutely perfect on paper won't get a job if they don't fit the company culture. Now, lots of research in personnel psychology and organizational studies show that this is a rational and actually a smart response by employers. You want employees that fit the way you do things. But there's a lot of research about the discriminatory aspects of hiring for cultural fit that need to be part of the conversation. And so I wanted to share a brief story about why we really decided to focus from a more critical perspective on the skills gap, and especially focus on the role of what we call cultural capital. One of our first field sites was in a small town in northern Wisconsin called Superior. It's a quintessential manufacturing town that's down on its luck. And so when this company called Kestrel, which basically makes jet planes for really rich people, said that they would relocate to northern Wisconsin and create 600 middle-class, middle-wage jobs, it was a big deal. This would have transformed the local economy. Excuse me. And so people were excited, and the local technical college, in response, created a new program in aerospace composites. This is a technology for repairing parts of the airplane. And you can see it was framed explicitly in terms of preventing the skills gap. So they're going to create a pipeline or a pathway to the aerospace industry, and in particular, Kestrel Aircraft, one company. Now I'm going to show a really short video from the instructor who designed this program. And as you watch it, I'd just like you to pay attention to the types of instruction he's using and organizing for his students, and also what he says about where he envisions his students going in the future.
Tim Wright, Composite Technologies instructor. I started out life several careers ago as a high school teacher. And in late 1997, I started with Northwest Airlines and started my aviation maintenance career. A composite is a material, which is composed of 2 or more materials. It's still very expensive, but so many manufacturers are realizing that that expense is something they're willing to accept for the product at the end of this, which has this amazing high strength, low weight, durability, resistance to fatigue and corrosion. I really like to get to know my students at a very personal level. My promise to them is that I will keep you engaged 100% of the time. Composite technology is a very, very rapidly developing field, and not just for aerospace, be that construction materials, recreational products, sporting goods, transportation industry, wind power. If they chose to go someplace other than aerospace, they'd be very well prepared to do that.
So if they would like to go somewhere other than aerospace, Tim feels his students would be well prepared to do that. And that was a prescient observation on his part, because what happened is Kestrel aircraft never got off the ground, so to speak. They never built their facility. They're actually having a really hard time repaying the state of Wisconsin lots of money in loans. And so the students recognized this was happening, and wow, they're not going to have those jobs there. And so they pulled out of the program, and they ended up shuttering this really promising program. Now, one of the things that Tim mentioned is that given his experience in aerospace, which is a really cyclical industry, he said every several years there's layoffs. Same in manufacturing. And that's why he was trying to train transferable skills in his students so that they can go into sporting goods or transportation. Now, the other thing, I don't know if you noticed, but his students weren't just sitting in chairs listening to Tim lecture. Now, this is a characteristic of a technical college classroom, but he also spoke explicitly about wanting to train his students in certain habits of mind, in ways of thinking, like an aerospace technician from a professional point of view. And he felt the best way to do that was for them to be working on real-world problems in small groups throughout their time in his college. So this raises some questions I think that we all need to be asking in this area of work. Should we be focused on creating pathways to specific jobs and industries, and or preparing students with 21st century skills that can be transferred across jobs and fields? From my perspective, this is definitely an and issue. Oftentimes I think it's framed as a false binary that we need to pick one or the other. In my view, based on our research and the policies that are being promulgated out there, we need to be thinking about both. So I really quickly want to share the framework that we're using to think about these problems as we go about our research throughout the country now. And I'd argue it's a more productive way to be thinking about student employability than the skills gap framework. And the idea of cultural capital is that depending on the context of your family, of the company, of your discipline, you acquire and internalize particular types of knowledge and abilities and ways of thinking. And again, if you envision a pathway, it starts in the home. It starts in people's upbringing. And then once they're in college, they acquire yet more forms of cultural capital based on the discipline, the types of instruction, and so on. Ideally, they graduate with these 21st century competencies, although there's no guarantee of that. And then when you talk about getting a job, that's where the cultural screening part comes in. There's a screening mechanism where depending on the type of cultural capital the company values, if it matches with the students, the chances are good they'll get a job. If it does not, the chances are not so good. One of the benefits of the cultural capital framework too is it really focuses on context. This is all not happening in a vacuum. Elections matter, the labor market matters, and students' lives matter. And all of these things are going to affect how a student experiences the acquisition of skills as they go through college. And so one of our conclusions was it's more productive and accurate to think about education and getting a job as a cultural transaction, instead of assuming that once they get their credential, they're guaranteed to get a job and thrive. So what does all this mean for the Career Pathways Initiative? So what I'd like to do with the rest of my time with you is to focus on 4 issues that I think could bear digging into a little bit more deeply and really thinking about as you all design the work at your colleges and universities. And the first one is that the ambiguity surrounding the term skills inhibits informed program design. So these are some data from our Wisconsin study. It's called a free list exercise, where we asked people, what are the skills that are essential for success in your industry as an entry-level worker? A salient score represents if that term was mentioned frequently across the sample and near the top of people's lists, which indicates that it was psychologically salient. I'll just point out a few. Technical ability was near the top of all lists, but notice that there is disciplinary or industrial variation here. So the manufacturers are in the middle, the biotech employers are on the right. Now, technical ability here is what cognitive psychologists call procedural knowledge, or knowing how to do something, not knowing about something. Work ethic was at the top of manufacturers' list, which is fascinating for an anthropologist to think about, because this is something that isn't cultivated just in school, but it implicates a whole lot of other elements in a person's life. But notice that it's pretty low down on the biotech list. Experience on the job and lifelong learning was near the top of the biotechnology employers list. And they explain this in interviews following this exercise, that this is because the science is changing so quickly in the biological sciences that they need students and new employees that are constantly able and willing to learn new things. And then problem solving I highlight because even though it showed up lower on these lists, it turned out in later conversations to be perhaps the most essential competency that these particular industries were looking for, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But one of the main ideas here is we're not just talking about one or two skills, we're talking about a whole suite of skills. And there's a whole lot of frameworks out there, hard and soft, cognitive, non-cognitive. I personally find none of them satisfying, but this is one, the National Research Council 21st Century Competencies, which I know you're all familiar with, that is really well grounded in the literature. But despite focusing on cognitive and interpersonal and intrapersonal skills, the main argument that is advanced by the NRC is that these skills need to be transferable. You need to teach students these skills so that they could transfer from one context to another, whether that's across disciplines or from school to the workplace. The issue of transfer is paramount. Now, I mentioned problem solving, and I just want to share a quote here from a manufacturer. We spend a lot of time here, so having people that are just horses' asses, for a lack of a better word, we just don't want them here. A, because it's a pain to be around them, and B, it takes away from the meaningful discussions and the problem solving, which is basically what we do here. So this picture you see at the top, we did a lot of factory tours in a lot of modern manufacturing facilities where they're doing lean manufacturing. Much of the work is organized around small groups of people, communicating either orally or in writing, problem solving in teams. So when it comes to the actual work, the skills are integrated. They're not just standalone, discrete competencies, but they're more of a combination, a repertoire, if you will. But they're also deeply embedded within the context of that profession and that company. And so the way this person talked about these skills was different from another company context. One of the things that's really great to see is people that study occupations of work get this. This is the types of knowledge, skills, abilities, work activities, and work styles required for a biological technician, according to the ONET database, which is a really rich database of occupations. But you can see here, just talking about skills or critical thinking in the abstract, without drilling more deeply into what does that mean for that occupation, really isn't sufficient. We need to be talking about these things in a much more fine-grained manner. One of the other issues that also needs to be on the table is the fact that skills and how we talk about them and think about them are culturally constructed. So this is a quote from those focus groups that the manufacturing lobby did. You know, when we, a manufacturer, measure when we're trying to hire somebody, it's YOTF. And I said, what is YOTF? And the guy said, years off the farm. Now, what this means is that a low YOTF quotient is preferable. You want somebody that just walked off the dairy farm. Now, for the employers, they talked about rural upbringing as code for having a really strong work ethic, having a really good technical background in machinery and things like that, really good complex problem-solving skills, maybe not really good communication skills, but they see a rural upbringing is bringing this whole package to the employer. Now, the context of this conversation, this comment, though, has to be thought about in terms of central Wisconsin, which is a predominantly white Protestant part of the upper Midwest. And so it does raise questions about how are people constructing ideas of where students are coming from and skills such as work ethic. What does it connote for people? What does it mean? So some of the design implications that I'd like to advance are the skills students should be acquiring by the end of a program articulated with precision and attention to disciplines within your initiatives and your institutions. So I just pose these questions as things to think about. They may be worth dwelling on. The other is curriculum and instruction organized in your institution to deliver these specific skills? Because once we identify that these skills are essential, the next step is to figure out, well, how are we providing students the opportunity to acquire them and practice them? And so that leads to the second issue. How educators can cultivate 21st century competencies, from my perspective, is the central problem. There's clearly a lot of other issues we need to be thinking about and addressing, but this matter is one of the big issues. It's the nut that we have to figure out how to crack. And there's a whole lot of research in the learning sciences about evidence-based teaching methods, such as using varied representations for students as they perform a task, encouraging students to self-explain. Even talking aloud while they're reading and reasoning through a math problem has been shown to improve retention of knowledge and student learning. Then interactive instruction. So instead of lecturing like I'm doing with you right now, having students actively manipulate material and generate ideas with peers. These are all things that the literature has been shown to improve student learning and the acquisition of some of these competencies. Now, it's one thing to read about it in a journal article, and here's a best practice. It's another to see it in practice. And so in our research, as we went around Wisconsin, we documented what some instructors were doing. And some of the most promising examples we saw included problem-based learning, multi-audience writing. This was in a biology class where students were expected to write for a lay audience, a technical writing for policymakers, and then professional scientific writing. Course-embedded projects, and then classroom management skills. That one was interesting because a lot of instructors felt that they couldn't and weren't responsible for teaching work ethic, but they could at the very least impose some strict rules for turning things in on time and acting well within the classroom. I'd like to focus on problem-based learning, though, because this is one of the educational reforms that's really being pushed all the way from kindergarten up to higher education, because it's been found to be a really rich pedagogical method for cultivating a variety of skills, technical expertise, as well as teamwork, communication, and problem solving. Now, one of the questions that comes up, though, is, well, if I'm not from industry, or if I don't have a whole lot of real-world problems at my disposal, how do I, as an instructor, get those into my classroom? And one of the novel approaches or solutions to this we found at UW-La Crosse, where a biology professor had created a website where he and his students had gone out in the community and collected problems of practice from employers, the nonprofit community, politicians. They posted them on the website, and then faculty in the university that wanted to integrate them into their courses could do that. And then at the end of the semester, or whenever the project ended, the students would either post the results of their project or go back to the original client and present their findings. So this is just one example of ways to complete the loop between industry and academia. One of the problems, though, is this stuff isn't easy to do. And a lot of faculty have not been taught how to do it. These are data that come from another study of mine based on classroom observations of STEM faculty in research universities. And by far, the most dominant instructional technique is lecturing with PowerPoints. Now, I'm not one of the people that says lecturing is a bad thing and that it needs to be abolished. It plays a really important role in effective teaching. But this is the state of the art for a lot of instructors. This is what they know. A lot of faculty have not been taught in learning theory, how to construct a syllabus, classroom management, and so on. And so this issue of how to introduce some of these techniques to professional teachers is a critical issue. Now, one of the things that I'll note about this, because I'm going to talk about some research findings from educational reform on this point, is that a lot of research on educational reform has been found that if you design initiatives that meet people where they are, so to speak, or at the very least acknowledge the context of people's work and how they make decisions, they're far more effective. And so this is some research I did about how faculty construct what in cognitive science you call the problem space of teaching. The problem space is the parameters of a particular problem that the problem solver constructs. And in our research, we found when faculty do this, they really draw upon contextual factors in their environment, things like class size, how much time they have, and then personal factors, their past experience, and what are their beliefs about student learning. In particular, we found that workload, so the lack of time to think about teaching, and beliefs about student learning are some of the most influential elements that create a faculty member's problem space. Now, after this problem space is constructed, though, when you get into course planning, unless a class is brand new, by far the most dominant practice is retrieving old PowerPoint slides or lecture notes and then altering them. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, it's just one of the practices that's happening for STEM faculty and research universities. And the point here, though, is that curricular artifacts, once they're created, have a lot of power. They have a lot of staying power. And then, of course, this leads into classroom teaching. And so when I talk to people about, okay, how do we change how faculty teach? Well, first of all, it's hard. And then if we want to target some specific areas, how the syllabi and the curricular artifacts are constructed and stored and changed, if at all, is one of the key leverage points we need to be thinking about, as well as beliefs about learning. Do faculty believe that communication is an important skill for their students to have? Now, as I share all that, though, I want to be cautious about this because one of the things that's happening in certain states, and Wisconsin's one of them, is the deprofessionalization of the teaching workforce. So this is a funny, not funny quote from a faculty member at River Falls. Morale on campus is lower than it's been at any job I've ever worked, including waiting tables at Pizza Hut in high school and detasseling corn when I was 14. So this is after $500 million in budget cuts over the last 4 years to public higher education in Wisconsin, and constant denigration by policymakers about the job of teaching. Overpaid, underworked, researching things that don't matter. And so the people that are on the front line of cultivating skills in the state of Wisconsin are not a happy bunch right now. And if you add on top of that, you must change how you teach. That's yet another thing that for this beleaguered workforce may be a bit too much to bear. So I'm not saying that to not ask your faculty to change, and I'm not sure the climate in some of your states, but in Wisconsin, pedagogical reform is a tough thing to be pushing right now. So some design implications. Is rigorous training in instructional design provided to all of your faculty? And I'd say as a new assistant professor who just went through orientation, the orientation is a key issue. I think we were talked to about 45 minutes about this issue. That's not enough. There needs to be more intensive than that. And then our specific 21st century competencies integrated into course and program learning outcomes. Because if they're not there in that curricular artifact, the chances are pretty good it's not going to be a focus of that course. And again, just to talk about the teaching workforce, just to remember that effective teaching isn't all about technique. That's one of the unfortunate things I feel is happening with some of the teaching reform movement. It's not all about technique, but it's about creating a really rich and supportive learning environment for students. So this third issue is a more recent concern of mine, and this is that quality co-curricular programs require a lot of resources and planning. Governor Walker, in his most recent budget plan for the state of Wisconsin, set this proposal on the table: require all students pursuing a degree from a UW system to have an internship or work experience before graduation. So in other words, if you wanted to get a bachelor's degree, you have to have an internship or some other work experience. As you can see, this was couched specifically in the terms of the skills gap. because this would bridge the gap between higher ed and the workforce. So this was an unfunded mandate that was thrown on the entire higher education system with no warning. Luckily, the state legislature stripped it out, but it's going to come back. But what it reflects is a lack of thinking about how hard it is to actually design and pull off and administer really good internship programs. And so this led this new center I developed to do a literature review on internships. What do we know? And there's not a whole lot of research on internships out there. There's a whole lot of practitioner how-to guides, which are really rich and valuable. But when it comes to empirical research about what do we know about the design of internship programs and their long-term impacts on student outcomes, most of it's from a European context, and very little is about the design of internships. Now, when we looked at the practitioner literature, we did see that characteristics of effective internships are the following. It needs to be an extension of the classroom, and this requires the educator and employer to really coordinate, to really talk together so that what is being learned in the classroom is being applied in the job site. There needs to be the meaningful integration of the student into the employer operations. So I'm sure you all have heard about an intern that was stuck in a hallway and just made copies or served coffee all day. That happens a lot. And interns need to be meaningful integrated into what the company is doing real tasks. And this leads to high quality job site mentoring. There needs to be somebody on the job site that's not just checking in like once over the course of 6 months, which also happens. They need to be there more regularly. And they need to be providing regular feedback to the student on how they're doing. And this also applies to the educator side as well. And then one of the biggest issues out there is pay. For many students, taking on an unpaid internship is simply untenable. And because internships have been found to increase rates of callback by employers, this is simply not fair and borderline unethical. And so dealing with the issue of pay and whether or not the employer observes the FLSA standards is really important. And so some design implications are clear and consistent definitions for what constitutes an acceptable internship articulated at your institution. One of the problems we found in our literature review is very few people define internships for one, and then there's no consistency. Even within a single institution, we found different definitions of what is an internship. And then are sufficient resources allocated for program administration and employer engagement? One of the things that the University of Wisconsin was given by the state government was 2 FTE to manage internships for a multi-campus system of thousands of students. That's not enough. And then a third question is there a single point of contact for employers to engage your institution about internships? This is a common complaint by employers that they don't know who to call. In some colleges, departments or colleges run separate internship programs, and career services could run yet another. And so there needs to be some internal coordination and attention to structure. And the last issue I'm going to raise is this issue of cultural fit. And I argued that students need to be prepared for this reality. So like I'd mentioned before, 74% of our employers talked about this. And when we pushed on them, well, what does this mean, hiring for cultural fit? Well, they talked about the company culture in a variety of ways. It's defined by the nature of work we do, like we do biological sciences or advanced manufacturing. But by far the most important thing that defined the corporate culture for these companies we talked to was the existing staff. So who already worked there? What were their behavioral norms? What was the climate that was created within different work units and departments? So then when a student comes in to apply for a job, different characteristics of the student are being mapped onto this corporate culture. And by far the most important one was personality type. So what we're seeing here is a process of the hiring manager looking at the applicant and saying, does this person's personality and their attitude map onto people I've already got in that work unit or that department? And how they do that, there's some CV screening where that happens, where you could look at a person's work history and say, oh, they don't have a good work ethic, they're not going to fit. But by far, it's an interview process where hiring managers are reading body language. They're kind of feeling out personality cues. And sometimes we had a couple people say, we ask offensive questions to see how they react. because that's how I know people on the job, on the shop floor actually work. So what does this look like in practice? This is one HR manager saying, we have a relatively young, energetic, casual workplace. You go to the lunchroom here and it's loud and obnoxious, and there are people who are like friends. That's the kind of environment that we have, and we try to gauge whether the applicant is going to fit with our corporate culture. So research on this process in sociology has found, and now this research has mostly been done in elite financial services firms, that hiring managers are often thinking with the frame or the mindset of, can this person be my friend? Would they be a good drinking buddy? And so you need to think about the implications of these issues for students. And again, in the skills gap conversation, this is completely absent, this cultural screening mechanism, which has so many implications for discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and class. And so some of the design implications, our students provided with opportunities to do extensive mock interviews, because it's the interview process where a lot of this is happening. And so in recent focus groups I did with undergraduates in a business school, they said this by far was the most valuable thing that they did. They were able to practice this and get lobbed some of these, not offensive, but hard questions, and they were critiqued on how they responded. And then our students talked about hiring discrimination and the fact that it exists and possible implications for their job search. Now, when I give this talk, this is the finding and the issue that by far, no matter the audience, comes up as, well, what do we do about it? And I definitely have no easy answers. But when I talk to hiring managers in the audience, they say, you know what? Have an open and honest conversation about this with some employers that you work with, because many of them are aware of it. When they're taught in human resource programs, they're told about it. And it needs to be an ongoing conversation about the fact that this is a phenomenon and it needs to be addressed. And so I'll conclude with this question, are we on the right track as a nation, at the state level, at the institution level? And it's definitely a qualified sort of. I think the focus on completion agenda and orienting higher education to the labor market's essential, it's important. We do need to change. But the inattention to issues of curriculum and instruction, specificity of skills, and this issue of hiring for cultural fit means that we have a long way to go. It's really great to see how the CPI, again, is taking a comprehensive systemic perspective on looking at some of these issues, but definitely at the policy level, and in my current home state of Wisconsin, we have a long way to go. And I'll end with this one question and issue, that we need to be balancing the employability issue with other goals of education. What you see up here is state legislation from Wisconsin setting forth the charter of the University of Wisconsin mission. The governor inserted some language to meet the state workforce needs, which I think most people agree, that should be a mission of a university. But in the process, he removed a whole lot of language that I don't know if some of you have heard of the Wisconsin idea, but this is a famous idea that's been around for almost 90 years. And he removed that. And I'll just read some of the language that was removed so that they could fit in, meet the state's workforce needs. It had to do with meeting public service, educating people, and improving the human condition. That was removed. And this is the best part that was removed. Basic to every purpose of the system is the search for truth. Now, when this leaked, because it did leak, there was a huge uproar across the state. Rural, urban, academic, everybody said, no, you can't mess with this. So they said it was a drafting error. But the point is that in the attention that we're putting on student employability, in some cases and in some ways, something else is being lost. And so the next steps for our research program, like I'd mentioned, we're expanding the study of Wisconsin to different parts of the country and also in eastern China. And in that research, we're focusing on teamwork, communication, problem solving, and self-regulated learning skills. And if they're being taught in academia, and then if they're being trained in the labor market. And as Aaliyah mentioned, we also started a new research center on student experiences with this process. And if any of you are interested in finding out more about it or possibly participating with some of our research initiatives, please get in touch. There's two I'll mention right now that we're doing. It's a study of how internship design impacts student outcomes. It's like I mentioned, this is a big gap in the literature. And we're also initiating a small grants program so that researchers who are interested in studying these phenomenon could be provided with small seed funds to study these problems. And so that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, please fire away here or get in touch via email.
So I have a really quick question for you.
Yes.
And that is in your the listing of the skills, critical thinking was there, but I didn't see creative thinking or creative problem solving. Is that incorporated under collaboration or just subsumed under critical thinking?
So what the data were that I showed you, it's when we asked the respondents about these issues, it was verbatim from what they said. And so that issue of creativity, when I think about it, they listed a whole lot of terms and we had to standardize them and put them under categories that captured the intent of that idea. But creativity was not mentioned frequently. Yeah. Right. This all has to be qualified. This is a small sample. Now we're doing this study again in other cities and professions. And we just got back from Houston where we're studying the nursing occupation, which I find fascinating because I don't know anything about healthcare. Now I'm getting a crash course, but empathy was near the top of the list. And empathy is fascinating because, I talk to communication specialists and they say, well, that's part of communication. And they say, no, it's not. And so, well, what is it? And then how do you teach it? And so just a plug for health education, medical education, I think what they're doing in terms of pedagogy and active instruction and skills development is leap years ahead, or not leap years, many years ahead of some other professions. But anyways, yeah, those are data that came straight from the respondents.
Matthew, if I may, did you share the title of your book, or is as you were presenting, it appeared that it was either a scholarly article that was published or a book? May I know the name of the book, please? The title.
Beyond the Skills Gap.
Beyond the Skill Gap.
And I brought a few flyers for it. They're somewhere in the back, as well as a flyer for our new center, and then a little policy brief that came out of the primary data that are in the book.
Okay. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I do have a question.
Yes, please.
Okay. I see where your next steps will take you beyond into other regions and other countries. Could you talk a little bit for me, please, as to the breadth of the research within the United States, regional differences? I see that you did industry. It appeared a lot of manufacturing. Could you talk about how your data, how you gathered your data, the types of companies, maybe that would be helpful, but also the regions and anything that you noticed, for example, where, of course, the southern region, anything that you noticed that would be pertinent to us within the southern region?
Okay, thank you for that question. So this current study, it's a National Science Foundation 4-year study, and we're in our first year. So we've only been to Houston and studied the oil and gas industry and healthcare, and the specific occupations are nursing and petroleum engineers. What we're doing is it's a mixed method study, so we're administering a survey to employers in that industry. The details of getting those lists together is mind-numbing. I won't bore you with that. But then we're also surveying educators in technical colleges and 4-year universities and colleges. Then we're also going in and interviewing a subsample of those populations about the types of skills they're focused on, how they're teaching, how they're training, how they're hiring. And then because the student in the employee experience is rarely present in a lot of the research and conversations, we're doing focus groups with students in the programs and then newly hired workers within those companies. So we're hoping to triangulate between and among those data sets. Regional and industrial variation we're hoping to look at, but we've only done one area so far. We're going to be in the Raleigh area in the fall, and then Seattle and Denver next year. And so I guess I'd be able to answer more of your question once we have some more data. The Chinese comparison is fascinating, though, because what they're experiencing, at least in vocational education in China, is really similar to a lot of the issues that are being grappled with in the United States. But when it comes to things like hiring for cultural fit and how much autonomy faculty and presidents and administrators have, they don't have a whole lot. So I'm expecting to see some really interesting regional and professional variation within the US, but I'm very excited about some of the cross-cultural differences as well. So sorry I didn't have more details about that. Yeah.
All right, we're going to thank Matthew Ora. I think Leah's over on the other side. Come on out.
Thank you, Leah.
All right, can we have another round of applause for Dr. Matthew Ora?
Thank you. Thank you all very much.